$300 a week. That's what it takes to keep a place like this running smooth. Call it insurance. You pay, nothing happens to the shop. Simple deal. No? You sure about that? A man alone out here? In your spot? I said no. You've got a boy back there, don't you? Dad, is everything all right? Think about it. 300, or we're back. Marcus Whitlow walked into Ray Calloway's shop the way men like him always walked into places that weren't theirs, like ownership was already settled. He laid out his terms without ceremony, $300 a week, and nothing bad would happen. It wasn't really an offer. It was a threat wearing the costume of a business proposal, delivered to a man Marcus had already written off as nobody. What Marcus didn't catch was the stillness that came over Ray's hands the moment he set his wrench down. Not fear, something older, something trained into muscle a long time ago. Ray said no. Quiet. No theatrics. Marcus walked out sure the hard part was behind him. But what kind of man tells Marcus Whitlow no without a flicker of hesitation, without so much as raising his voice, and just goes back to the job in front of him? The shop smelled the way it always did by the end of the day. Engine oil, old rubber, the faint bite of brake fluid worked into the concrete over years. Ray Calloway had come to know that smell the way other people knew the smell of a kitchen. It meant something had been repaired. It meant the day had closed out right. He wiped down a socket wrench and hung it back on the pegboard, moving with the kind of unthinking precision that comes from organizing the same tools 10,000 times. From the back office came the soft scratch of a pencil. Dylan was working through homework at the little desk Ray had wedged between a filing cabinet and the wall 6 years back when the boy first needed somewhere to sit after school let out. The desk barely fit a notebook at a juice box, but Dylan never minded. He liked the sounds of the place, the hiss of the compressor, the knock of a torque wrench, the radio playing low enough not to intrude. He'd grown up inside those sounds the way other kids grow up inside a busy household, and to him they meant exactly what they meant to his father. Everything was where it belonged.
Ray stood in the office doorway and watched him for a moment, one leg tucked under him in the chair, pencil tracing careful loops across the page. A serious kid, quiet in the way children get when they spend most of their time around adults who don't talk much. He had his mother's eyes, that particular dark that caught the light strangely and made him look like he was turning over something he hadn't decided to say out loud yet. Ray didn't say anything. He went back to the bench. That was most evenings. High on the shelf above the parts cabinet sat a small ceramic urn. It had been there 2 years. Dylan had put it there himself the week after the funeral, choosing the spot with the total seriousness only a child brings to something like that. No hesitation, no second guessing. Ray had never moved it. It had simply become part of the shop, the same as the pegboard and the compressor and the smell of the floor. Elena would have found something funny in that. She used to say the place smelled like a machine, and now a piece of her sat at the top of it. Ray had opened the shop 8 years back, after a stretch of quieter rebuilding, learning to wake up without the old noise in his ears, learning what it meant to keep a schedule that belonged to him and not to a club, learning how to father a boy who'd never meet the man his father used to be. He and Elena had put down roots in Millhaven before Dylan was born, and the shop had been his way of making that permanent, not just a new address, a different life entirely. He'd meant it, every piece of it. The promise went back further than any of that, over 10 years, made in a parking lot that reeked of exhaust and stale beer, the night Ray told the club he was out. Elena had been in the passenger seat because she refused to sit at home waiting for a phone call. She'd said it plainly, the way she said things that actually mattered. She wasn't going to raise a child believing violence was what made a man strong. She wasn't asking him to play a part. She was asking him to choose, for real, who he was going to be. Ray chose. 2 years ago, in a hospital room with an IV taped to her arm and very little time left, Elena said it again. not because she doubted him, but because she knew him well enough to understand that some promises need to be spoken twice before they fully take. Ray held her hand and said yes. He'd kept that yes every day since. Through every moment the old instincts rose up like a familiar toolkit offering itself to use. Behind the filing cabinet in the office sat a steel box, roughly shoebox-sized, with a combination lock and a dent in one corner from a night Ray didn't discuss. He kept it there the way you keep something you can't throw out and can't quite look at, in the one place it stayed technically within reach without ever needing to be seen. He hadn't opened it in over a year. Inside, without
looking, he knew there were 4 things: an old photograph, a folded patch of leather, Elena's wedding ring wrapped in cloth, and a spiral notebook of names and numbers in his own handwriting. Nobody in that notebook had heard from Ray Calloway in more than a decade. Some had probably stopped expecting to. That was the point. Ray rolled a floor jack back under the bench and checked the clock. 20 minutes to close. He was thinking about dinner when the front door opened and Marcus Whitlow walked in for the 2nd time that week. Marcus moved like he always did. No knock, no hurry, the loose confidence of a man nobody who mattered had ever told no. 2 others came with him, a younger guy who took up a post near the door without being told, and an older one, past 50, weathered, but with the deliberate stillness of someone who'd learned to read a room before stepping into it. This one, Curtis Boyle, didn't bother looking at the tools or the cars. He looked at Ray. His gaze drifted once to Ray's left forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up near the cuff just enough to show the edge of an old tattoo, faded dark. Curtis's face didn't change, but his eyes stayed a half-second longer than they needed to before moving on. Marcus repeated his terms. 300 a week. Nothing bad happens. He said it like something obvious. Ray heard him out and said no. When Marcus tried a different angle, Ray didn't answer at all, just went back to the wrench in his hand. Marcus left the way he'd come, still certain, still trailing the quiet suggestion that Ray would think better of it before the next visit. Curtis went last. At the door, he paused a beat, didn't look back, and stepped out into the fading light without a word. Ray waited until the vehicles cleared out, then set the wrench down and walked to the office doorway. Dylan looked up, pencil still in hand. He'd caught enough through the little window to get the shape of it and was sitting very still, deciding whether to ask. Ray told him to finish up, they'd grab dinner. Dylan nodded and went back to his page. He didn't ask about the men, but Ray could tell the shape of the thing was already sitting in the room with them, even unnamed. Marcus sent 3 men back 2 nights later. He stayed away himself this time, and Curtis wasn't among them. These 3 were younger, louder, and showed up just before closing with the particular energy of people enjoying an assignment. Ray was under a lifted truck when the door banged open. Dylan sat in the back office, backpack on the floor, working through homework. Ray slid out slowly and read the room in the time it took to wipe his hands. This wasn't a conversation, it was a demonstration. Marcus needed him to understand the first visit had been the polite version. The first man shoved the tool chest off its wheels. It hit the concrete in a crash of scattering wrenches. The second swept the computer monitor off the counter. The third cleared the workbench in one long motion, parts trays, a timing light, rags, all of it, and the noise filled the whole building. Dylan appeared in the doorway. Ray looked at him once, and the boy went still, the way he'd learned to go still when something needed to be waited out. Ray didn't move toward the men. He stood by the lifted truck, hands at his sides, and let it happen, because Dylan was 12 feet away, and Ray moving wouldn't help yet. The second man found the motorcycle in the corner, the one Ray and Dylan had been rebuilding on weekend mornings, stripped to bare metal, working from a photo Elena had taken on a road trip the summer before she got sick. 7 months of Saturdays between them. The man grabbed a tire iron off the floor and brought it down on the tank. The sound in that enclosed space was enormous. Dylan made a sharp, involuntary sound, not a word, just a caught breath, and it was worse than everything else in the last 3 minutes combined. The third man's eyes landed on the top shelf. He crossed toward it slowly, deliberately, wanting the slowness to be understood, and reached for the ceramic urn. Dylan moved before Ray could say a thing. 4 steps across the floor, and he planted himself between the man and the shelf, both hands raised, not aggressive, just there. A 10-year-old standing in front of the only thing left of his mother in that room. The man shoved him, not calculated, reflex, the reflex of someone clearing an obstacle without thinking. Dylan hit the concrete on both knees and a palm, sliding 2 feet. He came up with a split lip, a bright line of blood down his chin. The third man grabbed Dylan's collar and hauled him half off the ground, turning toward Ray with the casual authority of someone holding a tool, telling him to get on his knees and apologize for the inconvenience of saying no. He said it slow, like Ray might need extra time to follow. Ray looked at his son's face, at the blood on his lip, at his eyes, not quite fear, but something close to it, a stunned stillness, the look of someone trying to understand how the world had rearranged itself in 30 seconds. For 10 years, Ray had kept a promise. Dylan would never grow up watching violence solve anything, never grow up believing that damage was what made a man strong. He'd kept it through every moment the old instincts rose up like familiar tools. He'd kept it the way Elena asked the first time in a parking lot and the second time from a hospital bed. Both times he meant it. This was not a situation the promise could survive intact. The promise itself had already told him so. He'd promised to protect Dylan, and protection was what the moment demanded now. He crossed to the rolling bay door and turned the interior lock. The bolt slid home like the end of something. He pulled off his work gloves one at a time and dropped them on the bench. The 3 men were watching him now. The one holding Dylan's collar had stopped talking. Something in the room had changed. Not the temperature, not the light, but the texture of the silence. The specific kind that shows up when a situation tips from one category into another, and everyone feels it before anyone names it. Ray looked at his son. "Close your eyes, bud." Dylan closed his eyes. What happened to the 3 men in Ray Calloway's shop wasn't dramatic. That was precisely the problem for them. No anger in it, no heat, no wind-up. He moved toward them the way a mechanic approaches a familiar problem, unhurried, economical, like a man who'd already worked out the answer and was just executing it in order. It was over in under a minute. When it ended, all 3 were on the floor, and Ray stood by the open bay door, waiting. "Go tell Marcus to stay away from my son." That was all. The first thing he did afterwards was cross straight to Dylan, crouch in front of him, take his face gently in both hands and tilt it toward the light to check the cut. He pressed a clean rag to it. Dylan let him, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Ray felt it, the particular quality of his son's stillness. Dylan wasn't scared anymore. He was watching his father with the focused, measuring attention of someone meeting a person they thought they knew and finding a whole other version underneath. 10 years old, already doing the math. "Who are you, Dad?" Not an accusation, a real question, asked without theater, which made it so much harder to answer than anger would have been. Ray didn't answer that night. He told Dylan to grab his backpack, and they locked up and drove home with the radio off, the question riding in the dark cab between them, neither one reaching for it again. The three men reported back to Marcus's headquarters, a back room in a bar 2 streets from the shop district, the kind of room that existed to remind people his operation had weight. Marcus listened from the head of the table, hands flat on the surface, face unreadable. Curtis Broyle sat in the far corner, looking at his hands, saying nothing. When they finished, Marcus looked at Curtis. Curtis asked for the mechanic's name.
Ray Calloway. Something shifted behind Curtis's eyes, quiet, immediate, the specific recalibration of a man who's just heard something that rearranges everything around it. He asked them to describe the man, his build, the tattoo he'd caught a glimpse of on the forearm 2 nights back. When they finished, Curtis sat quiet a long moment, then told Marcus what he knew, flat and unadorned. He spent most of his adult life on the fringes of that world, never a full member of anything serious, but close enough to know the difference between clubs that existed for the image and clubs that existed for something else. He'd heard the name Ray Calloway exactly twice, both times spoken in the register people reserve for something they consider genuinely dangerous. Ray had held the position of sergeant-at-arms, not ceremonial, functional. When the chapter needed a problem handled, they sent him. When the problem was the kind other men wouldn't get near, they still sent him. The men who'd ridden with him, scattered now across 6 states and mostly out of that life, wouldn't need a reason if he called. They'd simply come, because that was the nature of the debt. Debts like that don't expire just because time passes. "I saw his arm the first night," Curtis said. "Didn't say anything because I wasn't sure. I'm sure now." He held Marcus's eyes. "I've seen what happens when somebody picks the wrong target. It only goes one way." A reasonable man would have stopped there. Marcus wasn't unreasonable, but his whole operation ran on one principle, that his reach was total, and that principle had just taken a visible hit. 3 of his crew walked out of a building in under a minute by one guy, and that story was already traveling the way stories travel, where everybody knows everybody's business. If it settled in as fact, Marcus Whitlow's people tossed out of a shop like nothing, the whole structure holding his business together would start to crack. People paid because they believed the threat was absolute. Once that belief cracked, the money went with it. So the calculation, however messy the execution, was simple. Ray Calloway couldn't be pressured anymore. He had to be removed before this story became the permanent one. It wasn't about $300 a week now. It was something else entirely.
Worse than any direct threat, because it meant the shop had never been the real target. Dylan had always been the leverage. Marcus had just been waiting for the moment to say so out loud. Ray set the photo face down on the bench and swept the floor along the base of the center support column, the same ground where the fight had happened 2 nights earlier. Near the base, half hidden under a rag knocked loose in the chaos, he found a cell phone, screen shattered, body intact. One of the 3 men had dropped it and hadn't thought clearly enough on the way out to notice it was gone. He charged it on the counter and waited for the screen to come up. What was on it went further than he'd expected. Photographs of storefronts across the district, dozens of them, street addresses visible in frame, text threads reading like financial ledgers, business names, weekly amounts, dates paid, dates overdue, written in the loose shorthand of people who'd stopped being careful a long time ago. Messages from a contact saved under a single initial, matching Marcus's name, giving instructions that left little room for interpretation. Photos of at least 4 business owners taken without their knowledge, through glass, at ordinary moments, the same method used on Dylan. Ray copied everything to the office computer, then made 3 separate copies and sent them to 3 places. One to a lawyer in the county seat whose name had come up months earlier in a careful, sideways conversation over coffee with another business owner, the kind of conversation where two people talk around a problem because naming it feels like the first step towards something they're not ready for. One to the State Investigative Division with a plain cover message laying out the extortion structure and listing every business owner he could identify from the records. The third addressed to the regional paper, set to send automatically at midnight unless he logged in and canceled it himself. 4 hours later, a message came back from the lawyer's office. Received everything. Forwarding to investigators now. This is substantial. Stay safe. Ray read it once, pocketed the phone, and slid back under a car that needed finishing before a woman's medical appointment the next morning. He didn't open the steel box. He thought about the notebook once, standing with a hand on the filing cabinet, working through the logic, then took his hand off and went back to the car. The names in that notebook were a last resort, and he wasn't there yet. He didn't intend to get there, because getting there would cost him something he wasn't willing to give. What Ray didn't know, one of the 3 men from the first attack had come back that morning, not to confront anyone, but because he'd realized on the drive home he'd lost his phone. He parked down the street and watched the shop through a gap between buildings, and saw Ray at the office computer transferring files, exactly what a man in possession of incriminating records would do with them. He photographed the window and sent it to Marcus with one line underneath.
Marcus read it, and every option he had collapsed down to one. That evening, Ray drove Dylan 3 blocks to Mrs. Prentice's house at the end of Millfield Road. Late 60s, she'd watched Dylan after school for 2 years before he was old enough to stay at the shop alone, and still had him over sometimes when Ray worked late. Dylan liked her kitchen, the jar of butterscotch on the counter, the way she never pushed him to talk when he didn't feel like it. Ray walked him to the door, spoke briefly with Mrs. Prentice, then crouched in front of his son on the porch. "Stay inside. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone you don't know." Dylan looked at him. "Are you okay, Dad?" "I love you," Ray said. He drove back to Calloway Auto and Cycle alone. By the time he pulled in, Marcus's vehicles were already parked at the far end of the block, 3 trucks and an SUV, headlights slicing the dark. 13 men climbed out, some with bats, one with a length of chain. Toward the back, moving with the contained, joyless energy of a man who'd already decided not to enjoy what was coming, was Curtis Boyle. He'd come because Marcus told him to, and in Marcus's world, that still counted for something. He stayed at the rear and said nothing. Marcus came last, hands in his jacket pockets, unhurried. He pushed the door open and walked in. Ray stood waiting in the middle of the floor. Marcus looked at him, expression flat. "You could have made 1 phone call," Marcus said. Ray looked at him, expression flat. "I don't need to." Marcus spread the hands blaming the fault for what came next squarely on Ray, and the men behind him started moving. Ray had one real advantage, and he knew exactly what it was. He knew the shop better than anyone in the room. Every angle, every narrow channel where a group turned into a line, and a line turned into something manageable. He hauled the rolling tool cabinet across the main aisle, splitting the group and forcing a choice of sides. He used the truck lift as cover, the gap between the back wall and the parts rack as a choke point where only one man could reach him. At a time, he worked through them there, one after another, using the space the way you use the tools of your own trade, automatically, without needing to think about where anything was. He was fast, precise, no heat in it, which was the part that would stay with anyone watching, but there were 13 of them, and Ray was 42. Eventually, the math ran out.
A bat caught him across the ribs. He felt the impact before the pain arrived, the way it always does. A second blow landed on the side of his head from behind, and his vision whited out at the edges for 3 full seconds, long enough to lose the shape of the room. By the time it cleared, he was backed against the workbench, blood running from a gash above his left eyebrow, one shoulder barely working, 4 men down, the rest still on their feet. He wasn't winning. He hadn't expected to. He was buying time, and the time was nearly gone. Marcus reached into his jacket and drew a pistol, holding it loose at his side, the way a man holds something he's comfortable with. He looked at Ray against the bench, expression edging toward satisfied. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down. When he looked back up, something different had entered his face. "Looks like your boy wants to see his dad." The side door latch turned, and Dylan stood in the opening with the steel box under one arm, breathing hard from 3 blocks of running in the dark, still in his school clothes, gray hoodie, dark jeans, one shoelace undone, hair a mess, face flushed, eyes moving fast across the room, the overturned cabinet, men scattered on the floor, glass from the shattered parts rack, and finally, his father against the bench, blood on one side of his face, his arm held at an angle that wasn't right. He'd left Mrs. Prentice's house because he'd been lying on her fold-out couch, listening to sounds from the end of the street and trying to convince himself they were something else. He knew the sounds of his own shop. He'd grown up inside them, the particular clang of metal on corrugated wall, the crash of equipment, the way that specific building carried noise differently from anywhere else he'd ever been. He listened until he couldn't lie to himself any more, then went out the back door and ran. He'd cut through the office on the way in, the side door Ray always left on the latch when he was working, and grabbed the steel box from behind the filing cabinet because it was the one object he'd ever seen his father handle with a quiet, deliberate care that meant it outranked everything else in the room. He didn't know what was inside. He understood the shape of what you grab when the world is coming apart, and he grabbed it. Marcus looked at the boy in the doorway, then at Ray, and something in his face settled into satisfaction worse than anger. Curtis Boyle, positioned near the far wall through the fight, was looking at the steel box. Its lid had come half unlatched during Dylan's run, and as the boy stepped further in, it gave, most of the contents staying put, but the folded leather patch slid free and dropped to the concrete, unfolding as it fell, catching the overhead fluorescent square on. Curtis went completely still. Not caution, the stillness of a man who's just seen something rearrange his understanding of the room he's standing in and needs a second to process it. He looked at the patch, at Ray's face, at Marcus. Something moved behind his eyes, built from the same material as fear, even if it hadn't quite become fear yet. Marcus raised the pistol and leveled it at Ray, saying, no theatrics, that the phone, the files, all of it would get handled, and the simplest fix for the whole situation was currently in his right hand. He said it like he was describing something obvious. Ray looked at Dylan. The boy had picked the patch up off the floor, holding it in both hands with the same concentrated look he brought to engine diagrams and long division, anything that needed real understanding. He didn't fully know what he was holding, but he understood the older man across the room was looking at it like it was the most important object in the building. Marcus. Ray's voice carried the same flat, low register it always did. A man with blood on his face, a ruined shoulder, and a room full of people between him and the door, and no desperation in it whatsoever. Marcus's expression tipped toward amusement. Give me a reason. Ray's eyes went to Dylan, then back. If you turn that gun toward my son, you won't get the chance to put it down. No performance in the delivery. He said it the way he said everything, a plain statement, offered for whoever was listening to weigh. Every person in that room took it differently depending on where they stood, but every person in that room took it. Curtis stepped backward, one step, alone. In a room where everyone had been holding position, it landed like a sound. Marcus's attention snapped to him. "What are you doing?" Curtis's voice, when it came, was quiet, no apology in it. He wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. He was looking at Ray, the way you look at something you should have fully reckoned with and hadn't. "I told you who this man was. Told you the first night we walked in there." Another step toward the wall. "I'm not standing here for this." One of the younger men near the side door shifted his weight back, then kept shifting until he was no longer part of the group at center. A second did the same. No words, no consultation, simply no longer where he'd been. Curtis's withdrawal worked below language. It told the room that the person with the clearest read on what they were actually dealing with had decided the cost was too high, and that read moved fast through people already calculating whether to stay. Marcus looked around at how the positions had shifted in the last minute, and the ease drained out of his face. He'd built everything on one principle, that his reach was total. That when Marcus Whitlow decided a thing would happen, it happened, because nobody around him had ever chosen otherwise. Now he stood in this shop with a gun in his hand, watching his own people step away from him. What he was understanding, too late, was that the men backing off weren't afraid of what Ray was doing right now. They were afraid of something in the past that Curtis had just put words to, and there was no leverage Marcus held that could compete with a fear that size. Then his phone buzzed again. From outside, from two directions at once, came sirens, close, multiplying, red and blue light sweeping through the high windows. Marcus looked at the screen, at the door, at the men who were, at this point, simply people in a building who wanted out before the cars arrived. Ray crossed the floor toward him, same steady pace as everything else he did. Marcus raised the pistol slightly, then didn't fire. Some part of him had already registered that the window where firing made sense had closed before he'd consciously caught up to it. Ray reached him, took the pistol from his hand with a grip that settled the matter for both of them, stepped back, walked to the bench, and set it down. He didn't look at it again. The evidence had moved through the system faster than Ray expected. The lawyer forwarded the files to the State Investigative Division early that afternoon, and from there word reached enough of the business owners named in the phone records that a wave of corroborating statements came in over the course of the day. People who'd been too frightened to speak up for the better part of a year and stopped being frightened once someone else went first. Ray went first. It changed the math for 11 people who'd been waiting for exactly that. By the time patrol cars hit the lot, it wasn't a tip under review anymore. It was a file being acted on. Later that night, sitting in the office while officers finished up in the bay, Ray opened his laptop and found the scheduled message to the regional paper still queued 40 minutes out. He logged in and canceled it. The investigators had what they needed from people who'd chosen to talk. That felt like the right ending. Marcus Whitlow was arrested in the parking lot of Calloway Auto and Cycle, along with 4 others who hadn't cleared out fast enough. The rest were picked up over the following 3 days. The charges covered more than a year of extortion, property destruction, assault, and systematic intimidation across 11 businesses countywide. The phone records supplied the architecture. The business owners supplied the confirmation. Clean case by any measure. Curtis Boyle wasn't charged. He'd driven Marcus to collection visits and waited outside for most of them. Not nothing, but not enough for prosecution. He left Millhaven within the week, and nobody in town heard from him again.
That night, after the officers finally cleared out, Ray and Dylan sat together on the tailgate of the truck in the empty lot. The shop glowed inside from the one overhead fluorescent that had survived intact. Dylan had the patch in his lap, turning it over in his hands since they'd come outside, studying it with the same patient seriousness he brought to anything he was still working out.
Did you used to do things like them? Ray looked at the shop, the overturned cabinet, the broken rack, the motorcycle in the corner with new damage stacked over old restoration work. It looked like a place that had survived something serious and was still standing. That felt about right. There were times, he said, when I was worse than them. Dylan absorbed that. He didn't pull away, didn't look upset in any obvious way. He sat with it the way he sat with hard things, seriously, without rushing toward a response, doing the real work of revising the picture he'd been carrying of someone he thought he already knew. Watching that process in a 10-year-old was one of the harder things Ray had gone through, and he watched it anyway because he owed his son at least that much honesty. Then he told him, not everything, Dylan was 10 and some of it would need years before it could be understood, but the shape of it. That he'd been part of a motorcycle club when he was young, that the club had operated in ways he wasn't proud of, that he'd been capable of things back then he wouldn't choose now and hadn't wanted to choose for a long time. That Elena was the first person who'd made him actually want to become someone different, not perform a different version of himself for her benefit, but really become it, because she made the alternative look like the smaller life. That the choice he made when he left had been real, made freely, and he'd meant it. He told Dylan about the promise, the first version made in a parking lot more than 10 years back, the night he told the club he was done, and the second version from Elena's hospital bed 2 years ago, not because she doubted him, but because she knew him well enough to understand some commitments need saying twice before they're fully real, and she wanted to be sure he was carrying the words with him. He told Dylan he'd broken the letter of that promise tonight, used his hands exactly the way he'd spent 10 years refusing to do, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, because Dylan had been in the room and seen it, and pretending things hadn't happened when someone had watched them happen was a particular kind of lie he had no interest in telling. "You did it because of me," Dylan said. "Yes."
Dylan looked down at the patch. "Is that why you kept this?" "I kept it because it's part of what I was. I couldn't throw it out without pretending that part never existed. And pretending things don't exist doesn't make them go away." He looked at his son. "You know that." Dylan did know that. He'd learned it the same year the urn went up on the shelf. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for any of it," Ray said. "That's not mine to ask for." He kept his eyes on the lit interior of the shop. "What I can tell you is I get to decide who I'm going to be every day you wake up the next morning. I've been making that decision for 10 years. Tonight didn't change it." Dylan sat quiet a while. Then he reached over and set the patch on the tailgate between them, face up. They both looked at it a moment. "Okay," he said. One word, plainly said. Not forgiveness, not the end of his questions, not a resolution to any of it. Just a 10-year-old's way of saying he'd heard his father and was willing to keep going from here. Ray put an arm around him. Dylan leaned in. They stayed on the tailgate until the cold made it impractical to keep sitting there. 3 weeks later, the shop reopened. People showed up before Ray had to ask anyone. Business owners who'd been paying Marcus's weekly fee for the better part of a year, arriving with tools and time and the quiet, purposeful energy of people finally doing something right after a long stretch of doing nothing. They replaced the bay windows, hung a new office door, righted the tool cabinet and bolted it to the wall. A man from the parts store 2 blocks over brought a replacement monitor for the counter. A woman whose car Ray finished the night everything happened dropped off food and left it on the bench without making a thing of it. The kind of thing that happens in small towns when something that needed to happen finally does, and everyone quietly shows up to say so. The motorcycle was the last problem. The tire iron had undone most of 7 months of Saturday mornings. Tank crushed, 2 restored panels cracked through, the wiring harness they'd replaced the spring before torn loose.
Ray stood over it the morning after reopening, running the math, landing honestly on the conclusion that starting fresh on a new frame would be simpler. He was working out how to say that to Dylan when the boy came in from school, dropped his backpack on the little desk, and came to stand beside him, looking at the bike the way he looked at anything he was working through. "We can fix it, Dad."
Ray looked at the photo of Elena above the parts cabinet, knocked to the floor during the attack, frame slightly bent now, image inside perfectly intact. Elena on a highway in Montana on a borrowed motorcycle, laughing at whoever held the camera. Ray had held the camera. He remembered the light that afternoon, the way she'd glanced back over her shoulder before he took the shot, the particular laugh she had when something genuinely delighted her. "Yeah," he said, "we can." They started that Saturday. Dylan worked the bodywork, Ray handled the wiring. The radio played low, the shop smelled the way it always had, and the hours passed the way good hours do between two people who know how to share space without needing to fill it with talk. About a month later, one evening, Ray opened the steel box. He took out the spiral notebook, the names, the numbers, the decade-plus of deaths kept current through years of silence, carried it out to the oil drum behind the shop, dropped it in, and lit it. He stood with his arms on the rim and watched it catch. Those names belonged to a version of his life he'd made his choice about long ago. And now that the choice wasn't a secret he carried alone anymore, it had become something else, simply a decision, real and permanent, no longer needing to be guarded. He carried the patch back inside and set it on the shelf by the parts cabinet, below the ceramic urn, not beside it. That distinction meant something to him, even if he couldn't have put words to exactly what. Dylan, cleaning a caliper at the bench, looked up when Ray set it down, studied it a moment, and went back to his work without a word. He didn't need to ask. He understood it the way he understood most things his father did when his father was finally being honest about something. That evening, Dylan closed the bay door and came outside, where Ray already had 2 mugs of hot chocolate waiting. They stood together looking through the window at the motorcycle, still unfinished, still visibly in process, but recognizable now as the thing it was becoming. Dylan looked at it a while, then up at his father. "Do you miss them, the people from before?" Ray looked into the shop, the tools in order on the pegboard, the urn on the shelf with the patch set below it, Elena's photo on the wall, the little desk where Dylan had done homework every afternoon for years. He let his eyes rest on all of it, then looked at his son. "No," he said, "I already have my chapter." Dylan didn't fully understand what he meant. He was 10, and there were things about his father that would take years to come into focus. Ray knew that, and for the first time wasn't afraid of it. Understanding would come. Time was the one thing they had plenty of in front of them, and he meant to use all of it.
He handed Dylan his mug. They stood together in the cooling air, and the past wasn't something Ray was running from anymore. It was just something that had happened, real, complete, and no longer following him home. Some men spend years running from who they used to be and never stop to realize the choice that mattered was already made the day they decided to show up differently. Ray made his the night he locked the bay door and told his son to close his eyes, and he made it again every morning after that.